What's going on, everybody? I hope you're doing well. It is once again that lovely time of year where the temperatures start dropping, the leaves start changing, at least for those of us in the Northern Hemisphere, and Adobe holds their annual conference, Adobe Max, in this case, Adobe Max 2021. Going along with this conference every single year is their unveiling of major updates to their Creative Cloud suite of apps, and that, of course, includes the Lightroom ecosystem as well. Now, I'll be covering all the major updates coming to the Lightroom platform in a separate video. For this one, however, I'm focusing on one key update that is absolutely a game changer for the Lightroom ecosystem, and that is masking. Now, I do need to warn you, this is going to be a lengthy video. I've got it broken into chapters, so you can jump from section to section if you like. However, I gotta warn you, so much is changing with this release that if you don't watch through all of this, you may find yourself kind of lost, maybe totally confused as you jump in and start trying to use this new masking functionality within Lightroom. So grab your beverage of choice, sit back and relax, and let's just jump right on into this. All right, before I start walking through every little new feature and tool with masking in Lightroom, first things first, you gotta ask the high-level question of what in the world is masking? You're probably already familiar with local adjustments, which are the graduated and radial filters, as well as the brush adjustment tool. Each of those allowed you to focus edits on specific parts of the image. Additionally, on top of those local adjustment tools, you could apply either a color range mask or a luminance range mask to further refine the edit you're working on. Masking takes those local adjustments and that concept of working on specific parts of the image to a whole new, absolutely awesome level with the introduction of several massive updates and enhancements and new features that I've been waiting for a very long time. Now, I'm going to go through each of these things pretty deeply here in this video, hence the longer length. But for now, let's do kind of a rapid fire step through of the new features that are coming to Lightroom. And one thing I really need to emphasize here is this is not just Lightroom Classic. This is the entire Lightroom ecosystem that are getting these updates with masking. So whether it's the mobile app, whether it's Adobe Camera Raw, which isn't really Lightroom, but basically it's what Lightroom is built on top of, the Lightroom cloud-centric desktop app, or of course Lightroom Classic, every single version has these new tools. So I'm going to be showing you Lightroom Classic here for the sake of the examples, but just know that it works basically the same across whichever version of Lightroom you happen to be using or that you happen to prefer. Totally awesome, long overdue, huge win for all of us. Now, masking is kind of built upon the old foundation of those local adjustments. However, it is far more robust and it's really been built new from the ground up so that Adobe could implement a whole slew of new features and advanced functionality that wasn't possible with the old local adjustment functionality in the past versions of Lightroom. One of the biggest changes is how color and luminance range masks work, whereas in the past you had to apply them on top of an existing local adjustment. Now they are completely independent and also far more flexible and powerful in terms of the ways you can refine and adjust them. And with this new masking functionality within Lightroom, you're actually creating masking groups, each of which can consist of either an individual or multiple adjustment types within the specific group in which you're working. I'll dive into this later because it's a very different concept from what we're used to, but you're going to see how it's absolutely awesome and one of my favorite aspects of this new masking functionality. Now, it could be said that masking kind of straddles the gap between Lightroom's traditional local adjustments and the layer functionality within Photoshop, but it is important to note that it's not exactly layers. Like I said, it kind of straddles that line a little bit, but it's not layers and it's not local adjustments. It's truly something new and different and robust and awesome. We'll keep going through that as we get further into the video. One of the coolest and most powerful new additions is Adobe's added in smart selections as part of this masking tool. With the simple click of a button, you can have a mask automatically created that just includes the sky of an image. With another quick button press, you can invert that so you're only selecting the landscape part of the image. Conversely, if you're a portrait photographer, click a button and it can automatically create a mask that is just your subject of the image, be that a person or an object or what have you. That's one example of some of the new powerful functionality that is included with masking that simply wasn't possible before with the old local adjustments platform. The other great thing here is you can create combinations of masks. I can create a mask based on a sky selection and intersect that with a mask based on color, or combine it with a mask based on a brush or a radial adjustment. You can combine and create and add and subtract and do all of these really complex things to get super refined, super complex masks in a relatively quick and simple manner. As I mentioned a moment ago, the color and luminance range masking has been completely decoupled from the other types of adjustments. So no more having to create a graduated filter off to the side of an image and then using that so you can do a luminance mask across the entire thing. You can now create a luminance mask on its own. You can create a color mask on its own without having to do anything else. And as I also mentioned, you can invert mask, you can intersect mask. So you can now tell Lightroom, hey, I want to adjust everything in this image. I'm going to select blue, but then I'm going to invert that. So really what you're telling the platform is, I want to adjust everything in this image except the blue parts of the image. You couldn't do that with the old local adjustment tools. On top of that ability to invert a selection, you can also intersect selections. So take, for example, selecting a sky and creating a mask off of that, but then saying, you know what, of that sky selection, that complex sky selection, I only want to worry about the darker portions of the sky right now. Maybe you want to cool down the shadows or the darker tones in the sky. A couple simple clicks, you can create an intersecting mask between that sky selection and a luminance selection. Where that overlaps, that's the only area that you're going to be adjusting. So you can easily adjust the darker tones, the lighter tones, the mid-tones, in a very, very complex mask. Now, there's a lot more to this. I'm going to walk through a lot more than what I just covered here. But the last thing I want to call out here, it seems like a relatively minor thing, but probably the thing I'm most excited about, probably the thing I'm as excited about as anything else, is the ability to actually name your masks. You have mask groups, you have individual elements within each group. You can name every single one of those. So thinking back to an image you worked on 6 months ago, a year ago, 2 years ago, you revisit that image today, and you've probably got local adjustment pens all over the place, and you don't remember what they were for. You've got to click on each one to see what sliders you tweak. You got to hover on it to see what portion of the image you adjusted. With masking, there's no more guesswork. You can name each mask group so that no matter when you come back to an image, you know exactly what you used it for. You can see all the details in the mask overlay, and you're good to go once again. The long and short of all of this is this masking functionality is absolutely awesome. As I said, it brings to the table a lot of features that I've been asking for and hoping for several years now. I'm absolutely thrilled with it. It is a lot to digest. It's a little bit difficult to wrap your head around some of it initially. That's why I wanted to do this deep dive video, to help you understand that and hopefully ease the transition from thinking about local adjustments to working in this new world of masking within the Lightroom ecosystem. I realize some of the things I just talked about probably made very little sense. So let me just stop right here in terms of this high-level overview, and we're going to jump right in, taking a deeper dive look at each one of these new features with masking. So starting right off the bat, coming into Lightroom Classic version 11, you'll notice where you normally would see the local adjustment options for the graduated filter, radial filter, and brush tool. Those are no longer listed here. Instead, you have a new icon here specifically for masking. And if you click on this, it's going to open up your initial default masking toolbar window, whatever you want to call it. And you've got a few different options here for creating new masks. Now, these first two, select subject and select sky, I'm going to walk through those in a moment. So we're going to skip those for now. But here's where you find your brush, linear gradient, and radial gradient options that you're familiar with, as well as color range masks and luminance range masks. So before we go into actually creating the mask, just a few things to show here real quickly. If I do choose to create a brush mask, the first thing you're going to notice is you have your adjustment panel that you're used to, whereas in the past on previous versions of Lightroom, your brush setting tools were down at the bottom of the adjustments. You now have that at the top. And then you come on down, you still have your usual presets selection here that you're, again, going to be familiar with if you've used Lightroom local adjustments in the past. I'll go further into creating basic adjustments or basic masks here in a moment. For now, what I want to show you is how you can actually modify this new mask panel here in terms of display and things like that. So first things first, it's going to open your default panel. If you already had some masks, those would be listed within here. And again, I'll show that a little bit further into the video. First thing you can do is you can collapse this down to get it out of the way a little bit. If it's overlapping part of your image you're wanting to look at or work on, just click these little arrows to pop it back out. The other thing you can do is you can actually drag this anywhere on the screen. So if I wanted to bring it over to the left, bottom, right on top of the image for some reason, I can do that. Or I can just bring it back up to where it is by default. And then the last thing you can do with this new mask management panel is you can actually pin it within the adjustment panel. So if you drag it over, you'll see that blue line appear. If you let go of your mouse button, now it's docked in here along with your adjustment panel. So you've got different options in terms of your preferences on where this is. I personally prefer to keep it just back in the original spot, but just be aware that those are some quick, simple things you can do in terms of deciding where you want the panel displayed and how you want it displayed. Okay, the next thing I want to walk through here is creating some basic masks. Now, some of this is still fairly similar to what you're used to with the old local adjustments functionality within Lightroom, but you'll start seeing where some of these bigger differences come in terms of the the workflow or user experience side of things, as well as how some of the tools actually work a little bit differently than what we're used to. So let's just jump on in here to creating the basic masks. So once again, I'm going to come up, I'm going to hit the new mask icon. So if I come here and click on this brush option, we're going to see some of the first big differences in terms of the user interface and how things are laid out. So if I click on brush, again, we already talked about how your new mask panel opens up here in this little upper right corner spot. So if I come out here and I click and I start brushing in, just like we're used to, I'm creating my brush adjustment. Nice and easy. If I were to delete this out and say I wanted to add one of the linear gradient adjustments, now because I've already opened up a mask, I'm going to just click the add button. And whereas before I selected brush, now I'm just going to come out here and select linear gradient. Just like with what we're used to, the direction you drag from is the direction where it's going to be painted from, and then gradient out to where there is no adjustment. So if I want to adjust the bottom portion of the image here, I'm going to click from the bottom and drag up towards the top. And you can see with this red overlay, it fades out from a full adjustment at the bottom of the image and then gradually fading out to where there's no adjustment at the top. Now, the other thing to note here, if I delete this out and then come back up, and let's add a new linear gradient. Just like on the prior versions of Lightroom, if you hold down the Shift key before you click and drag, it's going to keep that adjustment perfectly straight. So whereas before, when I was creating it, I was kind of wobbling back and forth, holding down that Shift key is going to keep it perfectly parallel with whatever direction you're pulling from. Just the same as what we're used to with the older versions of Lightroom. And once again, I'm going to right click, delete the linear gradient, come back up to add, and we'll do a radial gradient. And same again as before, you click and drag to create that adjustment. If you wanted to resize the radial gradient you've just created, if you just click on one of the grab pins here, it's going to change the actual shape of it. Whereas if you hold down the Shift key, again, just like we're used to, it allows you to adjust the size of it without adjusting the shape. And conversely, just like the linear gradient tool, if I delete that and come back up to add and go to radial gradient, and if I wanted to create a perfectly circular radial adjustment, I'm going to hold down the Shift key, then I'm going to click and drag, and now I've got a perfect circle. Okay, so let's talk about the next big change that comes with masking in the new versions of Lightroom, and that is around the color range masks and luminance range masks. Now, if we come in here to the masking panel, we've already got that selected, so I have my different options down here, and you can see, not surprisingly, you have options for color range and luminance range, as well as a depth range, which doesn't apply here. That's more for your cellular phones that have multiple cameras and can record the depth into the image file. But anyways, with the past implementation of color and luminance range masking in Lightroom Classic, you could only use those options if you already had a brush, radial, or graduated filter adjustment already applied. They were essentially coupled to an existing local adjustment. So the big enhancement here is not only do you now have these range masks, the color and luminance range masks available within all versions of Lightroom, not just Classic, but they've also been completely decoupled from having to have another adjustment already in place. So if I come in here to the panel and I select the luminance range, I can do that directly without having to apply anything else. And now by default, I've got my eyedropper icon here as my cursor, so I can just click on a single point, and you can see that now it has automatically selected everything in that brightest part of the image. You can gauge that by where the red overlay is applied, or I can draw the box option to grab a broader range of luminance from within the image. You can see that tweaks it a little bit further. If I come up here, I could say, let's go for maybe this kind of mid-tone that's in the clouds, and you can see now those highlights are excluded from it, and it's only pulling in the darker areas of the image itself into this new luminance mask. So this is a huge improvement over the way you had to do it in the past. It works the exact same way for your color masking as well too. So let's go ahead and delete this out, and we'll go to the add button, and now we're going to select a color range. So again, it defaults to now I've got my eyedropper. So let's just choose one of these warm tones on El Capitan. So now you can see by looking at the red overlay here that it's only selected the parts of the image that have that same color in them. Just like with the luminance masking, I can also draw a box to select a broader range of colors. Now you can see the mask gets much larger here because this, there's some darker tones in the rock face there, but you can still see us excluding the blue tones and things of that nature. So again, instead of having to create a brush or a radial or a gradient adjustment first, I can come directly into my image, choose to do either a color mask or a luminance mask, and I'm good to go. And then the last thing to show here with the color and luminance range mask is how you can refine them a little bit using some of the built-in sliders. So if I come back over and open up the masking section, And let's just start with color range. Now I've created a new mask. I need to set the parameters. So in this case, let's just say I want to create a mask that's only going to focus on this range of blues within the image. Now if I hit the O key to turn on my mask overlay, you can see that for the most part, other than some areas where some of the color tones overlap with some blues in them, it has masked out everything but that range of blues. Now what I can do is if I come over to the refine slider over on the right here, by default it's at 50. As I slide to the right, it's going to start blending things a little bit more, so more of the image is going to be pulled into that mask. Conversely, if I double click and reset this back to default, as I pull it to the left, it's going to refine it closer and closer to that specific color range that I selected. If I go all the way to the left, it's pulling in very closely to that window or that box that I drew. Now, there are a couple other things to note with these color range masks. So let me turn off this overlay real quickly. So right now, I've just selected that blue area. Remember, I drew the box, so it's a range of blues. If I came up here and drew a box from red to green to blue, it's actually going to do a blend of those colors combined. So I'm not getting just the area that was enclosed in the box as far as color tones go. I'm getting some other areas here as well. However, if I were to come in and select red and then hold shift and select green and then keep holding shift and select blue, now as we go into our mask overlay, you can see it is only pulling in those three specific colors. So kind of an interesting side effect here. Again, if you're using that box feature and clicking and dragging to select a range of colors, it's essentially coming up with a final blend of the color that you're looking for. Whereas if you do shift and click, you're going to get a much more defined mask selection on the individual colors that you click. And same thing here, you can use the slider. If I double click this, that's going to take it back to the default value. Pull it to the right, there's going to be more blending. Pull it to the left, it's going to be much closer to the exact colors that I picked. Now, if I delete out this mask completely, and let's come in here and try the same things with the luminance instead. So instead of looking at specific colors, I'm going to be looking at a specific luminosity within the image. So I'm going to click to create my luminance mask. So I've got that. Now, again, just like with the color, I can either click on a single point, and now it's going to be looking for luminance in the image that is similar to that single point I chose. Now, you can see this also is dependent upon the color as well. So if I remove the mask overlay, it's reading these greens and yellows and purples and blues as a brighter luminance within the image compared to the red and the blues. Now again, just like with the color selection, if I click and drag, I can create a range of luminosity. So now I'm pulling in those reds and blues that were excluded previously. And now if I hit O to turn on the overlay, now you can see we've got really what you would probably expect more is that the far right of these gradients are all selected because those are the brightest parts of the image. Now, some things to note in terms of refining this mask. So if you come over to the right, you have your luminance range, and you've got a few different things that you can adjust here. This box here, this kind of gray box that's got a slight gradient within it, is indicating what luminance range I've selected. You'll notice there's kind of little tabs on one end or the other. If I grab one of those tabs and start pulling it, I'm making that range narrower in this case. If I pull it back to the right, I'm making that range wider. Conversely, if I go to the left side of it, if I pull it to the left, I'm bringing in more of the dark ranges while retaining the selection on the highlights. And if I pull that back to the right, then I'm going to be excluding more of those dark ranges. And on top of that, I can click and hold anywhere in this little box, and I can drag the entire thing left and right. So you can see what that's doing to the selection I've made. Now you'll notice it's not changing the size or the range of luminosity. I'm just changing where within the luminance band the selection is made. It's the same total range of luminosity, but different parts, moving it either from the highlights into the shadows or maybe the midtones, simply by dragging this box back and forth. So I'm going to drag this back to the right a little bit. Now you also notice there's two little tabs on the bottom part here as well. Now if I grab those, let's say I'm grabbing this left one, that's going to let me define how much of a drop off there is from the range I've selected into the other luminance within the image. So let me just show for an example. So if I grab this and pull it to the left, you can see it is bringing in a softer transition into the other luminance of the image, in this case, into the shadowed areas of the image. If I pull it all the way over, it's going to basically fade from the selected range all the way into my deepest shadows. If I pull this back to the right, I'm going to exclude more of those shadows because that drop off is getting narrower. Same concept for the highlights. If I pull that one to the right, I'm increasing the amount of drop off or blending from the range I selected into the rest of the highlights. So you can see how you can refine this very easily and pretty specifically as well to help you hone in on the exact range of luminance you want to select for your edit. And the last thing you can do, obviously I've got the overlay turned on right now. If I hit the O key to turn that off, there is this option for show luminance map as well. If I tick that, it's giving me that red overlay by default to show me which parts of the image are impacted by the selection I made. So by using this combination of sliders, whether it's the feathering on the color selection or the drop off and zone range essentially for the luminance selection, again, you can see how all that plays together to really help you refine those masks to get them honed in on exactly where you want to be. Okay, moving right along here, the next piece to talk about is some enhancements they've made to the actual mask overlay itself. So right now I've got the overlay turned off for this luminance range mask. If I want to turn it on, I've either got the show overlay tick box down here at the bottom of the mask panel itself. Before, it would have been down in the lower left-hand corner, so they've moved that. The O shortcut still works. So if you just hit the O key, that will turn on the mask overlay. Hit it again to turn it off. Now, on this particular image, I've got the default red overlay selected, and let's say I find that that's a little bit hard to really gauge where my mask is actually being applied. If I click on the red color box here, now, instead of just having a few predefined color options to choose from, you can actually change the mask to any color of the rainbow that you would want. You can also choose whether you want it to be brighter or a darker tone of the color that you've chosen. So that's a nice little enhancement they've added in here. You can also adjust the opacity of the overlay. So if I want to make it 100% opacity or drop that opacity down so that I can see the image quote unquote behind the overlay, you can do that as well. The other thing you can do is come down to overlay shows, and by default it's selected for affected area, but if you click on that, you can reverse it essentially or invert it. So now if I choose unaffected area, it essentially inverted the overlay mask. So now the area that's selected for this particular mask is actually shown without any type of overlay at all. Now, I personally prefer to have affected area, so I'm going to switch that back. Now, before we close out of this, there's also another little option menu up here for overlay mode. So if we click into that, now you've got multiple options here as well. So I can do color overlay on a black and white version of the image. So if I do that, it converts the entire image to black and white, but leaves that red overlay. We can do image on black and white, image on black, image on white, or white on black, which is very similar to how you would see masks within Photoshop. And the general rule of thumb to remember here is that white reveals and black conceals. I've actually been using this white on black option because that's telling me that the areas that are white are going to be impacted, and the areas that are black or those gray or midtones are going to be less impacted if it's a gray tone, or if it's black, it's not going to be impacted by my adjustments at all. So that's the overlay I prefer to use. If I close this out, you'll also notice you can come up to this little menu here, and you have those same options right here as well. And you have another option here for show pins and tools. I have that set to auto. That way, if I close out of this menu, when I come out of the image, as soon as my cursor goes over the image, you're going to see my adjustment pins or my mask pins on here. As soon as I move the cursor into another part of the screen, those overlays drop off. That way I can easily see the image without those pins on there, so I can get a nice clean view of what I've done. And then if I want to go back in and grab one of those pins, I just move my cursor back in. And then if I didn't have the overlay already turned on, so let me just hit the O key to turn that off. The other thing you can do is you can actually come up and just hover on the mask itself. So whether I hover just on the mask group here at the top, or if I hover on one of the elements I've added, as long as you're on the little thumbnail representation of the mask, it'll automatically turn that on for you as long as you're hovering on it, and then turn it off, you just drag your mouse away. All right, moving onward and upward, we're starting to get into some of the really cool new stuff here with this next section right here. So I glossed over it earlier when I said we were going to come back to it, but we have the select subject and select sky tools now as well. These are both brand new to the Lightroom ecosystem. They've never been in a Lightroom version before. And from what I've been able to play with them so far, they work incredibly well, and they're going to allow for a lot of new masks that either weren't possible before or were way more complicated and difficult and involved to create. So let's just jump right into showing you how the smart selections work. So we're going to mix things up a little bit. Typically, as you all probably know by now, I am a landscape and nature photographer, but I wanted to show how this worked on portrait photography as well. So I've grabbed this stock photo, and if I come over to my masking panel, which I already have open, I'm going to just simply click on Select Subject. That's all you have to do. And depending on the speed of your system, the power of your system, it might take a few seconds. But as it runs through and scans the image, it's going to automatically create a mask based on the most defined subject in the scene. Now, that's something important to remember. I'll get back to that in a second. So right now I don't have the mask turned on, so I'm going to hit my O key. And now suddenly you can see just how well it has created a mask based on the subject it identified automatically. And this is using artificial intelligence, machine learning, all those cool buzzwords, but it's scanning the image for what is the defined subject within the image. In this case, this image is a great example because it's very clear that this person is the defined subject. Now, if we zoom in here, we can see that it's not 100% perfect on this particular image. Now, if I turn the mask off, you can see that where that little blur comes in here, the color of his suit jacket is very similar to the color of the background. So obviously stuff like that is not going to be perfect. It's going to be harder for the AI to pick that up, but I'll show you again a little bit ways you can easily fix that and go right in and begin your editing. So that's how it works on a clearly defined subject within the frame. If I come over to this next image here of this kind of food layout, if we try this again, you're going to see where right now it has some shortcomings. So if I come over and I select subject now, I'm going to hit the O key to turn on my overlay. You can see that in many regards, it did a very good job of selecting a mask for what it thinks is the primary subject within this frame, but you have this big section here that didn't get masked at all. So when there's not a clearly defined subject, this isn't perfect, but it's still pretty darn good. And what I'll show you again in a few minutes is how you can actually come in and quote unquote refine this mask a little bit to paint in the masking on some of these areas it missed. Now, if I come over to this final image of the tennis player and I go through this again, so I'm going to click select subject. And now you can see once again, it's done a pretty impressive job of automatically determining that this tennis player is the primary subject. The only place this one really quote unquote falls apart a little bit is around the tennis racket. But if we even zoom in a little bit here and look at how well it picked up the outline of his hair and the details it's got there, as you can see, this is pretty impressive, and it really opens up the door to do a lot of quick, simple edits that in the past would have been much more difficult to achieve. So really powerful tool here, especially for a first implementation of this. Really impressed. Again, I'm not a portrait photographer, but I can definitely see how, especially for portrait photographers, this would be huge. So moving away from select subject, let's take a look at select sky. So here we are back at this image from Yosemite. I'm going to open my masking panel. And I'm going to click on select sky. And again, it's going to go through the process of using AI, machine learning, to automatically detect where the sky is. Now, if I turn on the overlay, you can see that quickly it's got a fairly refined mask of what is the sky in this image. And again, if I zoom in here, we can see that it is pretty darn detailed. It's got all the trees selected properly, is not part of the sky, and it's working pretty well. The only place it gets a little bit off is when we start getting into some colors and tones where kind of the sky is blending in with the landscape itself a little bit. If I turn this mask off, you can see obviously there's a lot of similarity in terms of the color tones, and you've got the clouds dropping down. It makes this a little less obvious of where the sky ends and the landscape begins, but still really impressive the job it's doing here. Now I can jump over to a different image here. This is one I took from Colorado last year. And again, I'm just going to come in here and click on select sky, let it do its thing. And once again, we can see that it has done a pretty impressive job of determining which portion of the scene is the sky. And if I zoom in, we can again see that it just, this phenomenal job it did of selecting all of those trees as far as not being part of the sky mask here. So really very impressive again, especially just for a first iteration here. I've already been playing around with this, and man, it is awesome for doing some quick edits in the sky, and the way you can combine some of these things, which again, I'll show you in a few minutes, is just a game changer in terms of creating some really complex masks very quickly and easily. And again, there's never been anything like this within Lightroom in terms of just being able to select a sky or select a subject, things of that nature. So this is absolutely awesome. And you're going to see here coming up how you can start combining this with some of the other tools and just really creating some complicated masks very, very quickly that really let you fine tune your editing nice and simple and quick. All right, so a few minutes ago, I mentioned or made reference to the ability to do inverts on masks that you've created. So let's step through that now, show you some specific examples of what I'm talking about and how that, again, lets you get into more creative masking than what we've been able to do in the past. So coming back into my color gradient, let's just come over here and let's start with a radial. So I'm going to click on the radial gradient. I'm going to create a new mask, and I'm going to hit the O key to turn on the overlay. So now, again, we know that the white portion reveals the adjustments made with this mask. mask, whereas the black is going to be unaffected. So with the radials, you've got the ability to invert, same as we've had before. With all of these invert options, the apostrophe key is also your keyboard shortcut to invert back and forth. But where the new functionality starts coming into play is if I delete this out, and I come into my color range, and let's say I decide I'm going to choose some of the blue range here. Now for the first time, instead of saying I want to apply my adjustment to that blue range I just selected, now if I hit the apostrophe key, I can do everything but that blue range. So whereas with the previous versions of Lightroom and range masking, when you chose a color, you had no way to exclude that color. It was only including that color. So now with that simple shortcut key of apostrophe, you hit that, and you can say, okay, I've chosen the blue, but in this case, I actually want to exclude blue from the adjustments I'm making. Real quick and simple. And of course, the exact same principle is going to work on our luminance masking as well. So again, if I delete out that color mask, come in here and choose luminance range. And let's just choose this general area of green. Now, again, we know that it's pulling in anything with that general luminance on screen or within the frame. But again, if I hit the apostrophe key, it's going to do the inverse of that. Now, in the case of luminance, you could obviously do that by just selecting the different luminance range within the image. So it's not quite as groundbreaking as the ability to exclude a color, but still a quick and easy way to flip that and do the opposite of what you've selected. Now, one more time, let me come up. I'm going to delete this. And the last thing I'll show you is with the brush adjustment. So exact same concept. I'm going to come in here and let me just say I want to draw some weird brush adjustment in here for whatever reason. But now, once again, just hit that apostrophe key and it's going to do the exact invert. Now, another example where this really can come into play is with portraiture. So coming back to this gentleman, if I come in and open the masking panel again, and I'm going to do select subject like I did earlier in the example. Now we have him selected as the main subject within the image. But by hitting the apostrophe key and doing the inverse, now suddenly I can come in here. If I turn off this mask, I can say I want to darken everything in the background, but I don't want to impact him at all. I want to make him stand out. So look at how absolutely powerful this is and quick and simple this is compared to what we had to do in the past of, again, doing very careful brushing, and trying to use the auto masking with a brush, or trying to do radial adjustments and adding to them or removing from them. Now with literally a couple clicks of the button, I can darken this background down and leave my subject untouched. So really cool to have the ability to do the invert on your subject selection as well. And again, if I hit the apostrophe key, you can see I'm flipping it back and forth. Another example, going back to the tennis player. So I already have the subject selected here. If I hover on that, you can see that. So I'm going to select this mask. Now, if I hit the apostrophe key, I'm going to invert it. Hit the O key to turn on the overlay, and you can see, again, this is what it was when I originally selected. So anything in the white area would be impacted. Now, if I just want to impact the background, I'm going to hit the apostrophe key, invert it, turn off the overlay with the O key. And just like I did on the other one, I could darken that background down. I could blow it out if I wanted to. You can do anything you want. Maybe you want to take down the saturation in the background. You really make that subject stand out, again, with a couple simple, quick clicks. So you can see, especially with this portrait stuff, how really powerful this is and really streamlines the workflow that you've had. Or maybe you couldn't do it in Lightroom before and you were relying on Photoshop. Now you can keep it all within the Lightroom ecosystem. Oh, one more thing I nearly forgot is going back to some landscape examples. The same thing works with the Select Sky Smart Selection tool. So on this particular image, if I come over, you can see this is an image I worked on one of the older versions of Lightroom. So it's got all these masks added in here from the old local adjustments I've added. But if I wanted to, I could come in and create mask, select sky, hit the O key to turn on that mask overlay. You can see it's done an amazing job once again of selecting the sky and excluding trees and the mountain peaks and that. But let's say I wanted to, in this case, tweak everything but the sky. Same exact concept as the other ones. Just hit that apostrophe key and now you've got everything but the sky selected. Using another example, coming back over to this shot from Colorado. Again, I already have the sky mask on here, so I'm just going to click on that mask to select it. And as soon as I hit the apostrophe key, just like the other one, you'll see now it's inverted. And again, you can see all the little fine details. The trees are selected almost perfectly on the horizon here. So just an amazing way to give you that control of using these smart selection tools, not just literally for selecting the sky or a particular subject, but for actually excluding those things and letting you work on the rest of the images. So to me, the combination of the the smart selections along with being able to invert any type of mask you create is just so incredibly powerful. And I'm already finding all kinds of unique and different ways I can use this to really streamline what I've been doing in the past and just speed up my process or improve my process and get better masking and better adjustments on specific areas of the image. Okay, at this point, you should have a fairly good understanding of all of the new functionality that comes with masks in terms of creating quote unquote basic mask using the new tools. However, there's a lot more to cover here. I know this is getting to be a little bit of a long video, so I'm going to do my best to get through it as fast as I can, but you do need to understand this because in the long run, having that understanding is going to make things much easier for you. It's going to help you stay organized and really understand what you're doing as you work on images and get further into your editing process. So let's jump back to this Colorado image again, and I want to start talking about the concept of masking groups and how you can name those groups and the elements within the groups to keep yourselves organized. So to help you better understand what I'm talking about, I'm back in this Colorado image. We're going to do select sky. Now that's done its thing. So right now that mask is saying everything in this image that is white is going to get adjusted. So in this case, it's the entire sky. So if I want to drop the exposure on those blues, that's great, but you can see obviously it's also going to impact the clouds. So now what I can do is come up here and do a subtract. So what I'm essentially going to tell Lightroom is I want to subtract a color range. In this case, we're going to do blues. And now we've got several tones of blue in here. So we're going to use Shift and click to select several different points to make sure I get a good coverage of those blues. So I have the color chosen. If I hover on this, you can see that, of course, the sky right now is black because I subtracted that from that sky selection. And this is a kind of a preview of what we're going to be talking about soon here as well, is the concept of add, subtract, intersect, and all that fun stuff. So right now I have the sky mask and I've subtracted from it anything in that mask that's blue. So if I were to come in here now and adjust my exposure, I'm only going to be impacting the clouds. So this is a great way of saying, well, maybe I want to give those clouds a little bit of a bump in how white they are. So I can come in and tweak that and make those adjustments. On the flip side, if I wanted to adjust the blues, but not the clouds, then I would simply invert the blue selection I made. And now all of my adjustments are going to be impacting those blue tones and leaving the clouds alone. So again, this is just so absolutely powerful compared to what we've had before. There's never really, I feel like a broken record, but there's never really been the ability to be this specific in where you're applying your local adjustments. Now, if we look up at the mask panel here, you'll notice that I have mask 1 with a color range selection in it and that sky selection in it. So what you can do here is if you double click on the mask 1 header, now you have the ability to rename that mask or mask group in this case. So I could say that this is the sky blues only. Click OK. And now I've got my sky blue only. Now let's say I did want to also boost the whites in those clouds. What I can do now is I've got the group selected. If I click on this, you'll see the actual adjustments made within that mask. So again, a single mask group can have multiple adjustments and types of masks in it. If I collapse this back down and I come over to the little menu here, I can now duplicate sky blues only. So I'm going to do that. But what I want to do here now is instead of impacting those blues, I want to go back to my color range and uncheck the invert box. Because if you recall, that meant I was going to be adjusting just those clouds. So now I have a new adjustment here that's based on the sky, but only going to be impacting the clouds. So now I can do what I had said earlier. I'm going to brighten those clouds up. Maybe I'm going to add some clarity in them to add some additional texture, maybe a little bit of dehaze to add some drama. And now again, if I double click on this, I can say this is sky clouds only. Click OK. And now I can very easily come back to this weeks or months later and not have to try to find the specific adjustment pen to remember what was I doing and which pen was I doing it on. You can just come back to your panel and say, oh, well, actually, you know what? I want to make those blues darker. So I'm going to click on that sky blues only. And now I want to darken those blues up a little bit. So now if we look at the before and after of the image, you can see with 2 sky selections and corresponding color selections, what a dramatic difference that is made in the image just from a few clicks. Now you'll also notice that the actual landscape is getting darker. That's because I brightened up the landscape earlier with boosting the shadows. So that has nothing to do with these selection masks, just in case you're wondering why you're seeing that impact. Now you'll notice if I come back into that masking panel and we go to the clouds only, you'll notice if I come in and look at these clouds in particular, that with the boost and exposure I've done, that these are in a couple spots a little bit blown out. So in the past, what you would have done is if you were on a linear gradient gradient or a radial or a brush, you would have erased out of it. So the same concept applies here. So I can just hit subtract. I would come down to brush, or I could even use a radial in this case. Let's just do that. So we're going to select a radial. I'm going to click and drag this over. And now you can see the radial I just created, which in this case is still with the impact of the radial on the inside. The white is inside, but it has removed the adjustments from the clouds because they are within the interior of this radial. To put that in a little bit more perspective, if I zoom all the way out here and click the O button, you can see in this case, the clouds are all selected, but where the radial is, it's actually not selected. Now you've got a darker tone there, or more of a black tone there, telling you that is not being impacted. So that's a way you can come in and further refine these masks just by doing some real quick and simple things. Now, the other thing you can do is, I've got now 3 adjustments under the sky clouds only mask group. If I want to remind my future self of what I was doing with each of these, just double click on those, and now I can say radial to remove blowouts. Click OK, and now you've got that. Color range as well. I can say here, double click, exclude blues. So no matter how far down the line I come back to this, I'm going to know exactly what I did with each of these adjustments. Now, the other cool thing you can do, if I turn off the overlay mask here, so we've seen that I made this little radial adjustment here to bring down the highlights in this particular patch of clouds where they were blowing out after my exposure and white adjustments. If I wanted to come here and see what I just did, now with this you can. So if I come over to my panel here and go to this radial adjustment, now I have an eye icon next to it. I can either just click on it once and it's going to enable and disable that. So you can see that patch of clouds, if I'm hiding it or turning the eyeball off, is blown out. Click it again, you can see what I did with that radial adjustment. And you can do that on any of these. So if the exclude blues, I can disable that. And you can see that now my blues are being impacted with this adjustment again. Same exact thing with sky. Or you can do it with the entire mask group. So if I wanted to see what this was, I've got my blues only. I want to see what the image would be if I just had the blue adjustments, but didn't have any of these cloud adjustments. I can just come up here and click on that eyeball, turn it on and off so I can see what exactly I've done with either an entire group or with the individual elements within a group. As you can hopefully see by this point, you can get pretty complex pretty quickly. So I really do recommend definitely take advantage of the ability to rename your mask groups. Maybe you need to rename those individual elements within each group as well to help you keep track of what's what. Can't tell you how many times I've gone back to an image in the past and I've got like 15 brush pins on it and I don't remember what any of them did. So again, with the old versions of Lightroom, you had to click on them one by one and see what the sliders did, turn on the overlay to see what elements of the image were impacted. All of that headache and nightmare has gone away. I have literally been begging Adobe to add in the ability to name your adjustments for 2 or 3 years now at least. And here we are, it's 2021 and we finally got it. All of this stuff is really cool, but from an organizational standpoint, this is by far the biggest thing they've added in with this new masking functionality. Super excited about it. Make sure you're taking advantage of it as well. Okay, in that last segment, you saw how I started to delve a little bit into how you can use subtract to modify a selection you've already made with a mask. On top of that, you also have the ability to add to a mask you've created. So let's jump back into Lightroom here so I can show you a little bit more deeply how you can use add and subtract to start modifying the masks that you've created already to continue to refine them and refine them and refine them. So jumping back to this gentleman, again, this is the one where I've already got a select subject mask applied and I inverted it so that only the background is impacted in this case. Again, the white portion of the image is going to be impacted. And in this particular case, this is the image where the mask wasn't quite perfect. So if I zoom back in on this spot, you can kind of see it right here. If I apply the overlay, you can see that the jacket kind of started to blend into the background and the mask wasn't quite perfect. So what I can do here to clean this up is if I come up and select the mask, expand it out, and in this case, I'm wanting to add white into that part that's bleeding through. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit the add button. And again, you can do this a couple different ways. I could do it with a brush. I could do it with a radial. Easiest way here is probably going to be with a brush. So I'm going to come in and I'm going to size my brush to give me the control I need here. And I'm just going to start painting this in to get that mask a little bit better than what was created. Now I'm doing this kind of quick and dirty. I'd probably need to really change the feathering on this to get this a little bit more consistent with the rest of it. However, if I turn off the overlay, you really can't tell that it's not quite perfect. I mean, we're zoomed in a fair bit here. I kind of messed that up. Now here I could hit the Alt button and I'm going to subtract out that addition I just made. So I can come back in here and clean that up a little bit. It's not quite as obvious what I've done here. If I turn that overlay back on and I come up and I click the eye icon to turn off that brush addition I just made, you can see again really quickly and easily how I was able to refine that edge of the mask and get it more dialed into what I really want. Now zooming back out of this, turning off the overlay. Again, right now I'm only impacting the background here. I've darkened it down considerably, almost 2 full stops. But let's suppose I also wanted to, for whatever reason, darken his hat. So obviously that is part of the subject that was initially selected and then inverted. So right now the hat is excluded from the adjustment I've made. But what I can do is hit add. And in this case, I can now add a color range and say, you know what? I want to add the color of the hat into the mask. And now you can see that the hat has gotten considerably darker. Again, if I turn that off, this is what it was before. This is what it was after. It's a really easy way, again, to pull in other elements of the image that weren't included in the original mask selection, in this case, the subject selection. Now, you do notice when I added in the color of the hat, some of the skin tone colors and in his tie and that was pulled in. So what I can do now is come in to subtract, hit that, choose the brush again. And now if I paint over these areas with the brush, I'm cleaning this mask back up so that these areas aren't inadvertently being impacted by what I did to pull in that hat. So now as I turn off the mask overlay, you can once again see that none of his skin is impacted. And if I flip this back and forth, so if I toggle it off, before you could see a subtle shift in his skin tones, now that is completely gone. So just yet again, another example of the refinement that you can do within this new masking environment within Lightroom. Just super powerful. And really the possibilities are almost endless with what you can do through the combination of add and subtract. And then in the next section, I'm going to talk about intersect as well, where you can get further refinements by having intersections of different masks apply to each other and only the intersected area be impacted. So let's jump into that here next. So let's come up here and we're going to create a new mask. And let's just say I'm going to create a radial gradient. I'm going to create it over this pumpkin here. And I'm doing that because I want to pull down the highlights on that pumpkin a little bit. And let's just boost the saturation some on it. And I want to change the hue a little bit too. I want to go more towards a deeper orange. So what we can see so far is I have adjusted the color and luminance of the pumpkin, and it's subtle here. If I make this more extreme, you will be able to see though that I am including the area within the entire radial adjustment. So including his jacket and his hand and all of that. That's not what I want to do. So here what I can do is create an intersection of 2 different types of masks. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come here to mask 1. I'm going to click on the little menu here. I'm going to select intersect mask with. Now I can choose to intersect it with any of these other options. So in this case, I want to do color range. I'm going to come in here, I'm going to select a box on the pumpkin, and now suddenly, like magic, that jacket is no longer impacted because it's not part of the color range that's intersecting with that radial gradient. So I have the color range aspect here. Now you can see it's pulling in anything in the image on the color, because again, a color range, just like a luminance range mask, is looking at the entire image. But by combining it with that original radial mask as well, if I turn on the mask overlay in general for this entire mask group now, you can see that it is impacting only where the radial mask and that color mask I added to it are intersecting with each other. And actually I can make this more obvious if I come down to the radial gradient and I turn down the feathering. Now you can see just how tightly I am impacting just what I want to impact. Now I am pulling in a little bit again of the tie because there are some colors in the tie that obviously match the color of the pumpkin. So what I'm going to do here again, I'm going to zoom in, I'm going to move this up a little bit, and now I'm going to make sure I'm on mask 1. I'm going to subtract, choose brush, and just like I did on the prior example, I'm going to brush out these areas that I don't want impacted as part of this particular adjustment. Now again, I'm doing this pretty quickly, so I'm not going to worry about perfection here, but you just come in, paint out the parts you don't want impacted. Again, black is concealing the adjustment. And by doing this, I'm not going to have to worry about any of those other elements that are just getting picked up a little bit because they've got some orange tones in them from being impacted by this adjustment I made just for the pumpkin itself. So now if I turn this mask 1 on and off, you can see I am literally just impacting the pumpkin itself, not his skin, not his tie, not his coat, just that pumpkin, because again, it's the intersection of the radial and the oranges. So where those two things overlap is where the adjustment is being made. So it's a combination mask essentially. And again, if I turn that overlay back on, you can see just how exact this turned out. And now I can adjust this pumpkin further, make it look a little bit more natural, zoom back out, and there you go. So let's hop over to landscapes again and use this Yosemite photo as an example. We'll come in here, we'll go into the masking panel. In this case, I already have the sky mask applied. So what I want to do here is a couple different things. What I want to do first is impact the darker tones of the sky and cool those down a little bit. So I've already got the sky mask. So now what I want to do is tell Lightroom I only want to impact the sky where it intersects with a particular luminance range. So I'm going to come up to mask 1, intersect mask with luminance range. And I'm going to come in here, I'm going to say I only really want it in the darkest parts of the image. So now if I hover that, again, luminance, just like color, as I mentioned in the last one, it's going to look at the entire image. But since this is an intersection mask, if I come up and hover on this, you can see now it's on the selection of the sky and only the darkest parts of the sky. As with any luminance mask, I could come in here and refine things a little bit if I wanted to. I'm going to leave that alone. Let's say I just want to cool down those darker areas. I'm going to do this pretty extreme just so it's obvious what I'm doing here. But I'm cooling down the darkest portions of the sky. And again, if I turn on the overlay, only the white areas are going to be impacted. And if I turn this on and off, you can see the before and after. This is with it enabled. This is with it disabled. And maybe I want to actually pull the exposure further down on those darker areas. So this is an intersection of that mask. Now what I can come in and do is create a new mask. I'm going to select sky again. Once it's done, it's machine learning magic. Now I've got the sky selected. Again, I want this to intersect with another mask, but this time I'm going to have it intersect with just the highlights. So I'm going to come in, intersect mask with luminance range again. This time I'm going to come over and I'm just going to select the brighter portions of the sky. So now if I hover on this, you can see it's got the brightest portions of the image. And if I look at the mask in general, specifically the brightest portions of the sky mask. So now here, I actually want to warm these tones up a little bit. And again, I'm going to go a little to the extreme just so it's a little bit more obvious. I also want to bring those highlights down because there's some parts that are close to blowing out. And maybe we want to add in some clarity to add some texture back in. Maybe we want to do dehaze to add an even more dramatic impact to it. So by doing this, I've now created two separate masks. One that is specifically targeted towards just the brightest parts of the sky. Because again, I did a sky mask and I intersected it with a luminance range on the highlight end of the spectrum. That was combined with this original mask, which again was a sky mask coupled with a luminance range on the darker end of the spectrum. Turn that one on and off. You can see where it made the impact. Again, overdone for the sake of the example. If I come up to mask 2 and turn that one off, again, you can see it's only impacting those brightest parts of the image. I'm pulling in some of those clouds that you couldn't even see before because they were blown out in the highlights. I've warmed those highlights up. But again, for the sake of example, this is showing you exactly what you can do by combining or intersecting masks on top of masks. Let's take a look at one more quick example. I'm going to go back to the gradient color bars here. And in this case, what I want to do is let's do a luminance mask. So we're going to select a luminance range. So let's just say we're going to go for this range on the reds. Now by default, it's selecting that luminosity range throughout the entire image. But in this case, what I want to do is I only want to impact that luminance range specifically on the reds. And actually, let's go down. Let's say we really want to just look at the midtones on these reds. So I've clicked more into the middle range here. You can see that there's fall off on the left. There's a little bit of fall off on the right. So I'm focused more on the mid-tone range of the red bar. But again, it's looking at the entire image. So right now I've got the midtones of all the colors selected. So this, once again, is where I can use intersect. So I'm going to click into the menu, intersect mask with, select color range in this case, because all I want to impact is the reds. So I'm going to click into the reds. Now you can see that for the most part, all of the other bars are excluded, and I'm only going to be impacting that middle range of the red bar itself. I can come over and further refine this. If I hold down the Alt or Option key on the refine slider, I can see the overlay mask while I'm working, so I can really pull that in exactly. I can tweak it to exclude the other bars and make sure I just have the red and the specific portion of the red that I want. Now, as I start making adjustments, I can brighten that part of the red bar. I can darken it. I can do any other adjustment on here. I could desaturate it, and it's only going to impact the mid-tone ranges of those reds based on the luminance intersecting with that red color. Woo! I warned you that was going to be a doozy. I really do hope you found this helpful. I put a ton of work into this one. There's just so much to cover here. I knew it was going to be lengthy. I didn't want to shortchange it and skim over anything because there's just so much here that you really do need to understand to get the full value out of this new masking functionality within Lightroom. If you did find it helpful, please, of course, give it a thumbs up. I've got to say that by having a YouTube channel, I think I'm contractually obligated. And if you're not already subscribed to the channel, please go ahead and do that as well so you can follow along as I continue to release new videos going forward. I will have a high-level overview of all the new Lightroom features. Note that if you're watching this after Adobe Max 2021, which runs from October 26th through October 28th, that video is already going to be available for you. But otherwise, I really do appreciate each and every single one of you. And until next time, take care.